How did ancient people cut and move these gigantic stones? There's not one mistake in any of these sites that we see. They're perfect. It's mind-boggling.
Independent explorer and researcher of ancient history and lost civilizations.
Matt LaCroix.
I would caution anybody, if they want to understand the Anunnaki Anuna, it describes them as being what is called the second mind of God. I believe they literally left behind the clues like a scavenger hunt for us to find our way back to where we started.
Exploring ancient mysteries to document through his renowned novels.
The inside of the pyramids do not look like tombs, but that's the narrative that is pushed.
I think that there's definitely extraterrestrial life all throughout the universe, without a doubt. And I believe that those ruins are going to shift our entire understanding of lost civilizations in ancient history.
What do you think is one of the biggest myths, one of the biggest lies?
Oh, well, I mean, first of all,
Matthew, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I'm excited for this. This is the type of topic that I like going deep into, and I feel like I don't really get the opportunity to talk about it much. I believe I've done one episode with Dr. Greer where we kind of dabbled in some of these topics, but today we'll be going into a lot of different rabbit holes, I'm sure.
It's nice to meet you, Mike. It's good to be here to chat with you. Yeah, my love is ancient mysteries and lost civilizations. And so I know Greer does a lot more with like UFOs and things like secret government technology and things, but we can go a little bit of a different direction and talk about some of these enigmas of the ancient world.
Mm-hmm. Since when did you get into all of this? Is it from a very young age?
Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time now. It was a passion that developed within me from a younger age, but really became significant when I worked remotely back in my late 20s and into early 30s. I worked remotely at home for over 10 years. And one of the things that I started getting into was uncovering and exploring a lot of ancient mysteries through even just like audiobooks and listening to audio, because it was something that I was fascinated about. And I had one of the rare opportunities in life where someone gets a lot of time. I think that's something that's underestimated, is just having a lot of time and quiet and focus to be able to really explore something that you're very passionate about in different topics and become a bit of if you can, the best expert you can, and then be able to share and discuss and uncover those mysteries of the world. And so it started from a very primitive means of just being incredibly fascinated. And now it's grown to having leading a huge documentary with top experts from around the world, geologists and archaeologists, sacred geometry experts and architects and underwater dive experts, to go and explore and investigate these eastern Turkey areas around Lake Van, and also Peru and Bolivia, and the connections around the world with what I believe is a lost civilization, like Graham Hancock talks about.
Mm-hmm. Did he mention any of these specific places in his series?
Yeah, when he visited in Ancient Apocalypse, season 1 and season 2, he goes to places like Saskatchewan and different areas in Peru, and he doesn't go at all though to Eastern Turkey. I don't think he's ever been there. These sites around Lake Van, it's funny because you mentioned Turkey and people are like, oh, Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe, but this is hundreds of miles east of that, and a lot of these sites are actually far newer, which is why most people have not heard of them yet. I would give you an example. One of the sites called Korzut, I was very lucky on one of my trips in 2024 to go and visit that site, which is literally active right now. They just uncovered an ancient temple at the top of a beautiful mountain that overlooks this vast valley over Lake Van, and they just uncovered this whole set of ruins and megalithic, beautiful stonework, highly precisely carved, and we got a chance to go in and see it as they're uncovering it within the last year. So these are the most brand new new kids on the block in the archaeological world, and I think they're going to really shake things up.
How does something like this work? Because I mean, I don't know who discovered it exactly, but once it is discovered, do the authorities get involved and then start to kind of manage everything and say who can and who can't be excavating?
The I guess the way that we can look at this is that a lot of ancient sites around the world have turned into tourist sites, right? So
Yeah.
they've been around a long time, and they're not being, if there's an area that's being excavated, which there's a recent excavation being done at Chichen Itza in Mexico, but they like block off a little area and tourists can still sort of do their thing. It's not really that controlled in that way where people can kind of do what they want still. These sites in eastern Turkey are completely different. They're not tourist sites. Many of them are still private. I feel very lucky to know many of the archaeologists that are involved in those projects, and one of them has actually joined the team. And so we have had a chance to get access to private sites in places that the world hasn't seen yet that are just absolutely spectacular. I mean, the stonework, the level of quality and mystery behind how they created them, and the symbols and the teachings that are woven into them and left behind are just fascinating because of how they connect around the world. And so I feel very, very blessed to be involved in such important works related to ancient history and uncovering these mysteries.
Have they put a date on when the stonework was put together? Like
Yes,
how old are these sites?
well, and this is one of the issues that we're dealing with, that we deal with a lot of ancient sites around the world. There is a paradigm that exists that is taught in schools, and it's still in history books. It's this mainstream perspective that is actually hasn't budged in hundreds and hundreds of years, and longer than that even, of this established narrative of history. Right? It says that history started with the emergence of the Sumerians 6,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, and everything that exists that's not hunter-gatherers, right, is all within that time period of the last 6,000 years. That's the narrative that we're taught. So anything that's older than 6,000 years was a primitive hunter-gatherer civilization that there was no civilizations that had emerged. They were just groups that were moving around, hunter-gatherers. But that entire philosophy is greatly changing and I guess eroding. We'll call it right now. It's this old type of model of us looking back and saying, well, who were we in the past? What is our story in the past? What have we done? How do we view ourselves? How do we view our reality? And I think that lens has really constrained, actually, us for really understanding the vital components of our past and who we are and who we once were. And so I say that because I am basically premising for the fact that these sites, whether or not they're Peru, with being credited with being the Inca, who were only around for 300 years, we're crediting with building some of the most spectacular giant megalithic sites in the world. Like I was just in Napa Glacia, this beautifully carved granite protrusion that has like laser cut edges out of extremely hard stone, that the Inca did not possess those types of tools to even do that. And that's the same thing we see in Egypt with the dynastic Egyptians, the great pyramids never having tombs ever found and being credited with being built by the Egyptians. The same story is here in Turkey, in eastern Turkey, with a culture called the Urartu or Urartians, which were around about 2800 BC, so about 3,000 years ago, which are being credited with building so many of these ancient sites that I'm dealing with, whether or not it's Ionis that I showed you before, and we can take a look at that, or Kef Kalesi, or the underwater ruins, or I just mentioned Korzut and Kayaladir and Azvrinatepe. There's a whole host of these sites that have this mysterious base stonework with very primitive mud brick on top. But the problem is that archaeologists are crediting that primitive culture that was built right on top of them as being the ones that built the structures underneath. But it doesn't make any sense with conventional thinking of the tools that the Urartians had available, which were Bronze Age tools, to be able to cut a stone that is on the Mohs hardness scale. Like, so if you have the softest, like gypsum or something, or mica, would be on the Mohs hardness scale, what basically goes from 1 to 10, 10 being diamond, and 1 being like a very hot, very soft type of stone. These stones that they were talking about, basalt and andesite, are 7 to 8 often on the Mohs hardness scale, and they baffle our minds for how an Iron Age culture could have cut unbelievably precise cuts and these teachings and motifs into these stones, some of which cross over the barrier of where the joints connect. So like if you were using a chisel, right, in Iron Age tools, and you're chiseling through, if you have 2 blocks that have been fitted together perfectly, how do you seamlessly create something that passes between them? I guess maybe we could bring up that image and I could show you an example of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So let's pull up the image from, this is called Ionis Kalesi, and in this location you can see how where the fitting stones come together, there are symbols that have been seamlessly like laser carved between blocks. So if you were putting stones together, huge stones, fitting them together perfectly, and then you went back and you carved in these like laser cut symbols, how would you seamlessly go between blocks with chisels? It's like impossible. Not only that, but if you were creating all of these, and of course, we're showing that right now, that image, if you were creating all of these symbols, you would make a mistake at some point. Something would like, oh, I messed this side up. Oops, better start over or something. There's not one mistake in any of these sites that we see. They're perfect. And it's mind-boggling. I think it's completely over the heads of people to even like understand how these were created. And that's why I think what we're looking at is a massive paradigm shift of understanding ancient civilizations and this notion that if something is old, it's primitive. And that is what I think has really held us back for so long.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any idea what tool they could be using to do something like that? Do you think they may be using like vibrations or frequencies or something?
That's actually a great question. So I call it the sister site, because I showed you before. We'll pull up examples, and right now we can talk about is this huge T-pillar that's at a place called Chavus Tepe around Lake Vaughan. It's, I have pictures with it. It's like over 3 feet long. It's a multi-ton symbol that has this T shape with these 3 levels within it. That exact shape, or nearly identical, is also seen across the world in Bolivia at a place called Pumapunku. And when we look at the 2 sites, you see direct parallels, even though they're across the world, and they shouldn't have any connections. Because that's what we're told in history, is that those civilizations developed at different times. They had no maritime capability. There was no way that they could overlap. And yet, they have direct parallels in nearly everything they did. Now, the reason I bring that up is that in Pumapunku, it's had a lot more time. It's been around a lot longer, and they've had engineers that have been brought to Pumapunku with various experts, and they've done entire dissertations and papers and talking about this. But they went there, and the stone is the same kind of hardness, the same very similar stone as we see around Lake Vaughan, and they have looked at these cuts that are sharp enough to still cut your finger with these blocks and these shapes, and they've determined that it'd be nearly impossible with even modern day hand tools today. Some of these stonemasons have looked at that and said, we couldn't replicate this. We would have to use some kind of like a laser technology or some kind of electrical saw or something that has capabilities that are almost machine-like an ancient machine-like cuts. And that's really what we see around the world, even in Egypt. You see these saw cuts on some of these huge blocks that is bizarre and mysterious, and drill holes that are perfect. It seems as though these ancient people had some form of technology that we don't know or understand today. Definitely wasn't chisels. It's
Yeah.
something beyond that, and there's speculation that it could have even been related to maybe even plasma in some ways, the sun.
Hmm.
We don't know though.
I have to ask you, how have you not yet been to Egypt and the pyramids?
I'm working on visiting as many places as I can around the world. Egypt is literally the next one on my list to get to them because I've been studying those locations for
Hmm.
decades. Um, and one of the direct connections we have with Lake Von is actually the Osirion in Abydos, Egypt, with the flower of life symbols there. And so I'll be there as soon as possible to explore it. But there's a lot of important ancient sites around the world. There's still places like Baalbek, Lebanon I haven't been to, and the Yangshan Quarry in China, and the Imperial Palace of Japan, and there's so many ancient lost civilization kind of technology and structures that are on the base levels that need to be investigated.
What was the? Yes, that's it. Baalbek. There's a huge stone, isn't there?
Yeah,
Like
Baalbek,
a
Lebanon
really.
has. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to find it now. I remember I've seen some images of people standing right next
There's
to
a
that
stone in
stone.
Baalbek, Lebanon called the Trilithon, and it
That's it. Yeah,
weighs
the Trilithon.
1,200
Yeah,
tons, and it's the
yeah,
second largest megalithic stone in the world. And
yeah. And
we have no
it's
concept for how
elevated.
they cut or moved it. And so it's complete mystery, just like a lot of these other sites. With this, first of all, we don't know what kind of tech they use to cut these stones, because similar to Baalbek, Lebanon, if you go to Egypt and other parts of the world like Peru too, a lot of these huge stones, like for instance Ollanta Tambo, you can see this as well. There's still stones in areas that were cut out that are remaining, and like the unfinished obelisk and others in Aswan, Egypt, that you can see these very strange scoop patterns on the structures that weren't finished. Some kind of a technology they used to scoop out the host rock from the quarries before they were going to shape and cut it. But what kind of technology could scoop out of granite? It's one of the hardest stones on earth. It's an 8 on the Mohs hardness scale. How could you do that? So again, like the things that are left from these ancient civilizations boggle the mind if you understand geology and stonemasonry and some of the things that have been left over.
Yeah, I think when you go see the pyramids in person, you'll be very impressed. I mean, the only downside about the pyramids itself is Cairo's not the best place to visit in my opinion. It's a little bit all over the place. It's hectic. It's crazy, and then you've got like these amazing pyramids just on the outskirts of it, and it seems to be quite strange in the sense that I feel like there's not much activity going on in terms of the exploration and digging for more, I don't know, like more things, because
Yeah.
it seems as though there's a lot more that's not on show. Now, I don't know if that's got something to do with what's his name, Zawi Hawass, and
Zahi
who
Hawass. Yeah,
Zahi
he's in charge
Hawass,
of
yeah.
Egyptian antiquities. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know like what he's permitting and not permitting, but it feels as though like that site in particular, it's just been milked for tourists and making as much money as possible. What I've noticed as well was because I have been looking around and looking inside, in comparison to when I was in Luxor. When in Luxor you go to the Valley of the Kings and you go down into the tombs and you actually see like what the tombs should look like with all these paintings and drawings that are thousands of years old. The inside of the pyramids, in my opinion, do not look like tombs. Like it
Well,
just seems very
they're not
clear that
tombs. Yeah.
yeah. But that's the narrative that is pushed, and so many people that question that and go against it have just faced scrutiny for suggesting that oh no, they're not tombs.
And that's exactly what we're looking at, is a paradigm shift of information. The pyramids of Egypt, the Great Pyramids, the three, have characteristics of everything that we're talking about with advanced sophistication that is beyond anything that dynastic Egyptians were capable of. Like the first thing, let's think about the Great Pyramid for a second. It's 2.5 million stone blocks that average between 3 and 10 tons each. Now you have a limestone outer casing, but the center of the Great Pyramid, shafts that are up in the king's chamber that are over 100 feet above the valley floor have granite blocks built in seamlessly and perfectly cut into walls and above ceilings that are 10, 15, 20 tons or more. And it would be impossible with ramps and lever systems and all these things to try to explain how those were put into place and how they were put there. But when you study those pyramids and you look into the history of it, we're told, for instance, that Khufu built the Great Pyramid, and it was to house his tomb, right? Well, there's never been a tomb or any pharaohs or evidence of pharaohs in any of the three pyramids ever in history. It's wild to think that we're actually told that that's what their purpose was, even though those things have never been found, and there's not even any evidence that those ever existed. You brought up another key point a second ago called the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings is where literally all or most dynastic Egyptians in Egypt were buried. So you walk down and you see their tombs. Exactly, that's where they were buried. That they were buried there and not the pyramids. There's not one piece of writing that's genuine that's ever been found in any of the pyramids associating them with Khufu and other dynastic rulers that were there. There's not one. The whole story around the Khufu cartouche in the Great Pyramid has a lot of evidence to support that it was a forgery from the 1800s that was done by archaeologists in there, and that there's never been the name Khufu. It was like it was created for some kind of an agenda of history to help us to explain why they were built. So if someone says, wait a minute, so the pyramids aren't tombs, then what was their purpose? You open up this huge can of worms for trying to understand why they were done, when they were done, how they were built. So if someone just says, oh, well, they're tombs, and then the conversation's over. Then like, okay, so they're just tombs. The rest of it doesn't really matter as much. And that's really the purpose of, I think, them doing that. And you brought up also like areas in Egypt that haven't really been explored. That's a really big problem right now. One of the individuals that's part of exploring these mysteries in the documentary is famous geologist Dr. Robert Schoch, and he has been involved in sonar readings and looking underneath the ground in Egypt, looking down and seeing underground subterranean areas.
The LiDAR technology.
Yeah, LiDAR technology and sonar technology. And what they've found is that underneath the Great Sphinx, there are multiple entrances to subterranean areas. And actually under one of the paws of the Sphinx, there is a large subterranean opening that has been found using that technology back in like the late 90s, which was never investigated, because the story around it is that when they found that and it made the news everywhere about these subterranean tunnels and areas under the Sphinx, the Egyptian authorities and archaeologists, some of the ones that were involved in that, not all archaeologists are involved in that, but the groups that were primarily involved, like Zahi Hawass, what they did was they went to the area where that was supposed to be, but they deliberately drilled away from it to show that there was nothing below it, rather than doing right where it was supposed to be. And then they say, see, there's nothing here. It was a very, very tricky thing that was done. And then subsequently they boarded up the area around the Sphinx, and now it's like a conversation that can't even be really had in the academic world anymore.
Yeah, I have a feeling they found something which is not going to be fitting with the narrative which they're pushing.
No, it's true.
But it's a shame though, because it's like, it's so frustrating. It's like it's not fair to be hiding things like that from the general public just because you don't like what you found.
I think that that's happened a lot more than a lot of people want to take credit for. I've seen evidence from the 1964 era that a lot of these sites around Lake Vaughan, the same thing happened there. That they were things were hidden, things were moved and put in different places. There certainly seems to be some aspects of a covering up of our true history, and I think it's pretty obvious why. I mean, if we learned that there's a lost chapter of our civilization that reached great heights globally, like a lost golden age, where they built all of these things, the advanced things. If we were to learn that, how would that change our perspective about who we are and who we used to be? Because right now we're under the model that we come from a primitive time period, and that where we are now is the most sophisticated, and we've never been anything more than that. And yet here we have evidence to show that this civilization achieved things that we didn't achieve. We have not achieved now. And I mean that in a way where we have a lot of tech, right? And we're super digital and techy, but we don't have a lot of the knowledge that seems to be incorporated into their structures. Like, for instance, how did they lift the trilithon at Baalbek, Lebanon, that weighs 1,200 tons? Okay, a ton is 2,000 pounds. So how is that even possible from an ancient civilization? And I give you an example of that is when we look at those blocks and we look at modern day cranes today. Not even like people all trying to lift it, which is, it would be impossible. But if we look at modern day cranes, some of these blocks would be difficult to impossible to lift in modern day cranes. There's a site in China actually called the Yangshan Quarry, but it's not really a quarry. That name is kind of silly. In Yangshan, they have the largest megalithic stones in the world that were being incorporated in different structures. One of them is 16,000 tons. 16,000 tons. And you can see how they were trying to move it. They have grooves cut into the bottom of it that they were taking it out of the host rock, and they were going to move it over into the other part of it. But what's really interesting is, just like the Yangshan, and just like we see in Egypt with the Aswan Quarry, you have around the world in Easter Island, Baalbek, Lebanon. We're going to bring up all those locations for a second. So Yangshan, ancient Aswan Quarry in Egypt, Easter Island with the Moai, and in Baalbek, Lebanon, you have the largest single stones that had ever been taken, that were being taken out to be incorporated into structures ever in history. All at the same time, or seemingly, those stones were abandoned, and the work was abandoned right in the middle of it. And again, like I mentioned, in Easter Island, one of the moai that was being taken out of the quarry was 3 times the size of any other moai statue on Easter Island. 3 times, but it was abandoned. The Egyptian obelisk was the largest obelisk in the world. It was abandoned before it came out. Just like in Yangshan and in Baalbek, Lebanon, all of these colossal projects were being undertaken at what seemed like the height of the sophistication of these civilizations globally. And then all of a sudden the work mysteriously stopped and they disappeared from history. And that's where you get into discussing, well, is this from massive climatic and cosmic events during like the Younger Dryas, the last ice age, 12,000 years ago? Did it wipe everyone off around the world? That's what I truly believe, studying climatic data and geologic data and ice core data, is that these civilizations succumb to disasters globally that we have never seen in modern human history.
Mm-hmm. So something like an asteroid impact so big that not only was the impact destructive, but then you've got the aftermath of it creating an ice age, but very, very rapidly.
We have 2 hypotheses that are being explored. The first hypothesis is, and there's a lot of people that support this, and like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson are exploring the idea of an impact. So like you said, some kind of a meteor or comet hitting the Earth and creating disarray and the climate all collapsing and all these different events. And then the other camp, and the one that I subscribe to the most, which is Robert Schoch has spent a lot of time in uncovering in his latest book, Forgotten Civilization, and others, is that it was some kind of a massive solar event. So huge amount of energy that comes out of the sun that then weakens the magnetosphere of the Earth and creates huge tectonic movements and tsunamis and all these different things. Those two areas are what is being investigated because, like you said, you just mentioned the Ice Age, right at the end of the last Ice Age. So it's the time period of going from into the Holocene. What we find is this very, very serious set of evidence disaster indicators that come from that time period when the Earth lost enormous amounts of species around the planet, especially in the northern hemisphere and parts of the southern hemisphere, in conjunction with these events around the world that are believed to be related to the disappearance of these lost civilizations at the same time.
So I guess, I mean, if we're talking 11,000 years or more, you've got to think, like, how much of the Earth's just dirt or whatever has maybe just been buried on top of it. And like, I always think to myself, whenever I see things which have been discovered, I just think about how much has yet to be discovered, because it's all covered up, and it might even be covered up for, you know, 10s, 20s, 30s of meters.
Yeah, we even find evidence that some of the later civilizations may have actually deliberately buried some of the sites to preserve them. And that's what we're seeing at some of the sites in eastern Turkey, is that they were the Urartu culture, the Urartians, even though they didn't originally, I don't believe, build the lower structures, they had incorporated them into castles and other things during their time period. What we're finding evidence of is that they, along with places like Göbekli Tepe and others, may have been deliberately buried with enormous amounts of sediment because of the need to protect them, and that the time that they were in was volatile, and that they felt that they had to be preserved for another time period, like time capsules. But you also mentioned the areas that are buried from that disasters of that time period as well. Absolutely. I mean, if we look at, I'll give you an example, the Moai. We were just talking about the Moai at Easter Island. Have you seen where they show excavations down, way down into the bottom of the Moai, and you see that really what you're seeing is just their heads sticking out?
Yeah.
What really is that their entire bodies are under the dirt too. Think about how deep that is. You're looking at over 20 feet in some areas of sediment that is accumulated over the bodies of the Moai. And we have to imagine, if we're being told that those were built by the Rapa Nui only a few thousand years ago, then how would you be able to explain the enormous amount of sediment that is filled in over time? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't align at all with what we're told.
Yeah. I mean, have you seen those images of the Sphinx when it was literally just discovered? Like, you could
Like covered
only
in
see
sand, right?
the head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Is that, and that's just within the period of the dynastic Egyptians up until the 1800s, when they went and take pictures. Imagine that. Think about that. That's only a few thousand years. Now imagine how much would accumulate over something like 5 to 10,000 years on some of these locations. Compared to that, that's relatively recent, and like you said, it still was covered up to its neck in sand.
Yeah. Do you believe that the Sphinx originally had the head of a lion?
I do. There's the way you can tell. It's a lot of people think that it's speculation, but really, if you were to look at the proportions, so if you look at the body of the Sphinx and you look at the proportions of the head to the body, it doesn't make sense. It's very offset. The head is way too small for the proportions of the body. And if you look at all the ancient Egyptian knowledge about the connections with star connections, like Sirius and Orion, and also the most important one being Leo, the constellation Leo was represented as a lion, and it was considered to be a guardian. And that's exactly what all the ancient stories tell us. especially if you go to like Hermetic knowledge, talks about how there's subterranean areas underneath the Sphinx that were part of this ancient library that existed down there, and that the Sphinx was created to be a guardian of these subterranean libraries in the ancient world. And then what happened was, much like we see in other places, the dynastic Egyptians came and found the remnants of an ancient civilization that was long gone. And they built on top of it and incorporated put their own hieroglyphics into a lot of the stone. But more importantly, what they did is they recarved certain things. And one of them, primarily being the Great Sphinx, they recarved it as a pharaoh's head, which is actually enormously disrespectful if you were to think about how it was a lion and it was a very sacred structure to represent a guardian, and then you turn it into a pharaoh. To me, you're showing a complete disrespect for what that ancient civilization revered in the past, and you're trying to impose your own belief systems and supremeness on those sites. And I think they crossed a lot of lines when they did that, and it's probably no wonder that they disappeared the way that they did.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've never thought about it that way. That it's actually quite a disrespectful thing to do. It's like just graffitiing
and we shouldn't
over
underestimate
someone
that.
else's. Yeah. Is there any particular site that you are most fascinated by? One which you just really wish you had the answers to?
Yeah, I'll bring up another one because we just talked about Ionis a few minutes ago, and that is what led me into all of this. I started my own company called Ionis Legacy based on that site, because I believe that site will help shape a new understanding of ancient history. But I want to talk about another site that's associated with it, and that is that in 2017, there was a diver named Tossin Salin who is joined the documentary now. So he's a famous videographer, filmmaker who dives underwater in a lot of oceans around the world, like the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and does underwater photography. But he was diving in Lake Van, and he accidentally discovered underwater megalithic ruins under Lake Van. And I believe that those ruins are going to shift, in conjunction with things like Ionis, are going to shift our entire understanding of ancient lost civilizations and ancient history. Join me September of 2025 for a tour of the Lake Van area of Turkey to explore its ancient megalithic ruins. You can sign up on my website at thestageoftime.com. We'll see you there.